August 22nd, 1791. A tropical storm rages over the northern plain of Saint-Domingue, the richest colony in the world. In a clearing in the forest called Bois Caïman, hundreds of enslaved people gather in secret. A Vodou priestess named Cécile Fatiman slits the throat of a black pig, and the assembled crowd drinks its blood, swearing an oath to fight for freedom or die trying. Within hours, the plantations will be burning. Within weeks, thousands of slaveholders will be dead. Within 13 years, the enslaved people of Saint-Domingue will have achieved the impossible. They will defeat the armies of France, Spain, and Britain, declare their independence, and create Haiti, the world's first black republic. This is the only successful slave revolt in human history. Enslaved people rose up against the most powerful military forces on earth and won. They defeated Napoleon Bonaparte's battle-hardened legions. They created a nation founded on the radical principle that all people are born free and equal. And they did it all while the rest of the world watched in horror, terrified that their own enslaved populations might be inspired to do the same. This is the story of the Haitian Revolution, the uprising that changed world history, terrified slaveholders across 2 continents, and proved that enslaved people could not only fight for their freedom, but win it. This is about courage, brutality, betrayal, and the most important revolution you probably never learned about in school. Saint-Domingue in 1791 was the jewel of the French colonial empire, the single most profitable colony in the world. Located on the western third of the island of Hispaniola in the Caribbean, Saint-Domingue produced more wealth than all 13 American colonies combined. Its sugar, coffee, indigo, and cotton plantations generated roughly 40% of France's foreign trade and supplied Europe with nearly half its sugar and coffee. The port city of Cap Français was called the Paris of the Antilles, a glittering showcase of colonial wealth where French planters built magnificent mansions and lived lives of extraordinary luxury. But this wealth came at a horrific cost. Saint-Domingue's prosperity was built entirely on slavery, and the conditions enslaved people endured there were among the worst in human history. Approximately 500,000 enslaved Africans labored on the colony's plantations, making up nearly 90% of the total population. The work was backbreaking and deadly, cutting sugarcane under the tropical sun, processing it in mills where enslaved people frequently lost limbs to the machinery, working 18-hour days during harvest season. The mortality rate was staggering. Slaveholders calculated that it was cheaper to work enslaved people to death and buy replacements than to maintain them properly. The average life expectancy for an enslaved person on a Saint-Domingue sugar plantation was just 7 years after arrival from Africa. Thousands died annually from overwork, malnutrition, disease, and brutal punishments. French planters were notorious for their creative cruelty, burying people alive, burning them slowly, pouring molten wax on them, feeding them to dogs. These weren't rare aberrations, but common practices that were legal and socially acceptable. The colony's social structure was rigidly hierarchical and based entirely on race. At the top were the Grands Blancs, the wealthy white planters who owned the largest plantations and enslaved hundreds or thousands of people. Below them were the Petits Blancs, poor whites who worked as overseers, artisans, or small farmers. Then came the gens de couleur libre, free people of color who were often mixed-race children of planters and enslaved women. Despite sometimes being wealthy and educated, free people of color faced severe legal discrimination and social humiliation from whites. At the bottom of this hierarchy were the enslaved people themselves, divided into several categories. House slaves often had slightly better conditions than field slaves. Skilled slaves who worked as artisans, mechanics, or drivers had more autonomy. But the vast majority were field slaves who worked in the brutal conditions of the sugar plantations. Among the enslaved population were many who had been born in Africa and still remembered freedom, maintaining African languages, religions, and cultural practices. These African-born slaves, called bosals, were considered the most dangerous by planters because they had never been conditioned to accept slavery. By 1791, the tensions in Saint-Domingue were reaching a breaking point. The French Revolution of 1789 had sent shockwaves through the colony with its promises of liberty, equality, and fraternity. Poor whites demanded more rights. Free people of color, inspired by revolutionary rhetoric, began demanding legal equality with whites. And the enslaved people, hearing talk of rights and freedom, began wondering why those principles didn't apply to them. In March 1790, free people of color led by Vincent Ojay had attempted an armed rebellion demanding civil rights. The rebellion was crushed, and Ojay was executed by being broken on the wheel, a torture method where his bones were systematically shattered with iron bars before he was left to die in agony. His execution was meant as a warning to anyone who challenged the racial hierarchy. Instead, it convinced many that the system could not be reformed peacefully. The enslaved population watched all of this carefully. They saw that the whites were divided among themselves. They saw that free people of color were willing to fight for their rights. They saw that France itself was in revolutionary chaos, with authority breaking down. And they began planning something that had never succeeded before: a mass uprising to destroy slavery entirely. The ceremony at Bois Cayman on August 22, 1791, has become legendary, though historians debate exactly what happened that night. What we know is that a large gathering of enslaved people from surrounding plantations met in secret, led by figures who would become legendary in the Revolution: Dutty Boukman, a Vodou priest and plantation foreman; Cécile Fatiman, a Vodou priestess; and other leaders from the enslaved community. The ceremony combined African religious traditions with revolutionary purpose. According to accounts, Boukman delivered a speech that rejected the Christian God of the slaveholders and called on the African spirits for strength in the coming battle. He reportedly said, "The God who created the sun, which gives us light, who rouses the waves and rules the storm, though hidden in the clouds, he watches us. He sees all that the white man does. The God of the white man inspires him with crime, but our God calls upon us to do good works. Our God, who is good to us, orders us to revenge our wrongs. He will direct our arms and aid us." The ceremony concluded with the sacrifice of a black pig, its blood drunk by the assembled crowd as they swore an oath to fight for freedom or die. Within hours of the ceremony ending, the uprising began. Enslaved people across the northern plain rose up simultaneously in a coordinated attack that showed careful planning. They set fire to plantations, destroyed sugar mills, killed slaveholders and their families, and armed themselves with whatever weapons they could find: machetes, farm tools, a few guns stolen from plantations. The violence was horrific and deliberate. Enslaved people who had endured years of torture and brutality now inflicted that violence back on their oppressors. Planters were killed, often in the same cruel ways they had killed enslaved people. Women and children were sometimes spared, sometimes not. The rebels wanted to send a clear message. The old order was being destroyed, and anyone who tried to preserve slavery would die. Within a week, the northern plain was engulfed in flames. Hundreds of plantations burned. The sky turned dark with smoke that could be seen from Jamaica over 100 miles away. Thousands of enslaved people joined the rebellion, swelling the rebel forces to an army of tens of thousands. The wealthy planters fled to Cap Français, where they huddled behind fortifications, terrified and in shock. The richest colony in the world was being torn apart by the people it had brutalized. The colonial authorities were completely unprepared. Saint-Domingue had only a small garrison of French troops, and most were already tied down dealing with conflicts between whites and free people of color in other parts of the colony. The rebels controlled the countryside, and more enslaved people joined them daily. The plantation economy that had generated such incredible wealth ground to a halt. The sugar harvest was lost. The coffee rotted on the trees. The colony's wealth literally went up in smoke. Dutty Boukman emerged as the early military leader of the rebellion. He organized the rebel forces, planned attacks, and coordinated the destruction of plantations. But in November 1791, Boukman was killed in battle with French forces. His head was displayed on a pike in Cap Français as a warning to other rebels. The French authorities thought killing the rebellion's leader would end the uprising. They were catastrophically wrong. New leaders emerged from the rebel ranks, men whose names would become legendary: Jean-François, Biassou, and most importantly, a former slave named François-Dominique Toussaint, who would later take the name Toussaint Louverture. These leaders transformed the rebellion from a spontaneous uprising into an organized revolutionary movement. They established military discipline, developed strategies, and began articulating a political vision: complete abolition of slavery and equal rights for all people, regardless of color. The French colonial authorities tried to negotiate, offering pardons and limited reforms if the rebels would return to work. The rebel leaders rejected these offers absolutely. They had crossed a line from which there was no return. They knew that if they surrendered, they would be tortured to death. Their only option was complete victory or death. So they fought on. As news of the Saint-Domingue slave revolt spread across the Atlantic world, it triggered panic among slaveholders everywhere. In the American South, plantation owners tightened security and passed new laws restricting enslaved people's movements, terrified that their own slaves might be inspired to rebel. In Jamaica, Cuba, and Brazil, where slavery was also central to the economy, authorities went on high alert. The Haitian Revolution represented every slaveholder's worst nightmare: enslaved people rising up, killing their masters, and winning. But the rebellion also created a complex international situation. France, Spain, and Britain all had interests in Saint-Domingue, and each tried to manipulate the situation to their advantage. The rebels, showing remarkable political sophistication, played these powers against each other. In 1793, France and Spain went to war as part of the broader conflicts of the French Revolution. The Spanish, who controlled the eastern two-thirds of Hispaniola, offered weapons and supplies to the Saint-Domingue rebels if they would fight against France. Toussaint Louverture, who had emerged as the rebellion's most capable military and political leader, accepted Spanish support and began fighting for Spain against France. He proved to be a brilliant military commander, winning battle after battle and building an organized, disciplined army from former slaves. But Toussaint was playing a deeper game. He wasn't loyal to Spain. He was using Spanish support to strengthen his forces and gain military experience. When France, desperate to maintain some control over Saint-Domingue, issued a decree in August 1793 abolishing slavery in the colony, Toussaint saw an opportunity. In May 1794, he switched sides, abandoning Spain and joining the French Republic, bringing his entire army with him. This alliance with France was pragmatic, not ideological. Toussaint had evaluated his options and concluded that France, with its revolutionary rhetoric about liberty and equality, offered the best chance for securing permanent freedom for Saint-Domingue's black population. He also recognized that France's enemies, Britain and Spain, were slaveholding powers that would never allow a black republic to exist if they conquered Saint-Domingue. Britain saw the chaos in Saint-Domingue as an opportunity to seize the wealthy colony for itself. In 1793, British forces invaded, expecting to easily conquer a colony torn apart by rebellion. They were wrong. British troops, most of whom had never experienced tropical warfare, found themselves fighting on multiple fronts: against the French colonial forces, against Toussaint's increasingly powerful black army, and against yellow fever and malaria that killed British soldiers by the thousands. Toussaint proved to be a master of guerrilla warfare. His troops knew the terrain, were immune to tropical diseases that devastated the British, and were fighting for their freedom rather than for imperial conquest. The British commitment of over 20,000 troops to Saint-Domingue, but yellow fever killed more British soldiers than combat did. By 1798, the British had lost approximately 15,000 men to disease and combat and controlled only a few coastal fortifications. They abandoned the campaign, having failed completely to conquer the colony. By 1799, Toussaint Louverture had effectively become the ruler of Saint-Domingue. He had defeated the British, driven out the Spanish, and marginalized the French colonial authorities. The French government, recognizing reality, appointed Toussaint as commander-in-chief of the colonial army and governor. But everyone understood the real situation. Toussaint was in control, and Saint-Domingue was autonomous in all but name. Toussaint set about rebuilding the colony's shattered economy, but he faced a dilemma. The plantation economy had generated enormous wealth, but it had been based on slavery. Toussaint needed to restore productivity without restoring slavery. His solution was controversial. He implemented a system of mandatory labor where former slaves were required to work on plantations in exchange for a share of the profits. Workers couldn't leave their plantations without permission. Overseers could impose punishments for not working. Many former slaves saw this as slavery in all but name and resented Toussaint for it. They had fought for freedom, and now they were being forced back onto the plantations they had burned. But Toussaint argued that this was temporary, that the colony needed to restore its economy to survive, and that once Saint-Domingue was stable and prosperous, true freedom would follow. Whether he genuinely believed this, or whether he was simply being pragmatic about the economic realities, is still debated by historians. In 1801, Toussaint made his boldest move yet. He convened an assembly that wrote a constitution for Saint-Domingue. The constitution declared that all people in the colony were free and equal citizens. It abolished slavery permanently, and it named Toussaint Louverture as governor for life with the power to name his successor. The constitution was sent to France for approval, but Toussaint didn't wait for approval before implementing it. He was declaring autonomy, stopping just short of full independence. In France, Napoleon Bonaparte had risen to power and was not pleased with developments in Saint-Domingue. Napoleon was building an empire, and he had no intention of allowing former slaves to control France's wealthiest colony. He was also married to Josephine, a woman from a wealthy slaveholding family in Martinique who constantly pressed him to restore the old colonial order. Napoleon decided that Toussaint Louverture needed to be destroyed and slavery restored. In December 1801, Napoleon dispatched a massive military expedition to Saint-Domingue. 20,000 veteran soldiers commanded by his brother-in-law, General Charles Leclerc, with another 20,000 troops to follow. This was one of the largest military expeditions France had ever sent overseas. The soldiers were battle-hardened veterans of Napoleon's European campaigns. They came with specific orders: defeat Toussaint's forces, arrest the black generals, and restore French control. The secret orders also included restoring slavery, though this wasn't announced publicly. Toussaint initially tried diplomacy, sending envoys to negotiate with Leclerc. But Leclerc's demands were absolute. Toussaint must surrender unconditionally and disband his army. Toussaint refused. War was inevitable. In February 1802, the French forces landed and began their campaign to reconquer Saint-Domingue. The war was brutal. Leclerc's forces initially had success, capturing major towns and defeating Toussaint's forces in open battle. But Toussaint adopted a scorched earth strategy. Rather than let the French capture towns intact, he ordered them burned. Rather than fight pitched battles he couldn't win, he retreated into the mountains and waged guerrilla war. His message to his troops was clear: if you must leave, burn everything, so that those who come after you will find only ashes. However, Toussaint's coalition began to fracture. Several of his top generals, including Henri Christophe and Jean-Jacques Dessalines, defected to the French, accepting Leclerc's promises of maintaining their military positions. These defections were devastating to Toussaint's forces. By May 1802, with many of his allies gone and his army depleted, Toussaint agreed to negotiations. Leclerc promised that if Toussaint surrendered, he could retire peacefully to his plantation with his freedom and property guaranteed. Toussaint, exhausted and seeing his movement collapse, agreed. He formally surrendered and retired to his plantation. But this was a trap. On June 7, 1802, French soldiers arrested Toussaint at his home. Despite the promises made to him, he was put in chains, taken to a ship, and deported to France. He was imprisoned in Fort de Joux, a fortress in the Jura Mountains near the Swiss border. The conditions were deliberately harsh: a cold, damp cell, minimal food, no contact with his family. The French authorities interrogated him, trying to extract information about hidden weapons caches and resistance networks. Toussaint Louverture died in his cell on April 7, 1803, likely from pneumonia and malnutrition. His last words were reportedly, "In overthrowing me, you have cut down in Saint-Domingue only the trunk of the tree of liberty. It will spring up again by the roots, for they are numerous and deep." He was right. Toussaint's arrest and deportation backfired spectacularly on the French. Rather than ending resistance, it enraged the black population and convinced them that France intended to restore slavery. And their suspicions were confirmed when news arrived that Napoleon had restored slavery in Guadeloupe and Martinique. If slavery was being restored in those colonies, Saint-Domingue would be next. The black generals who had defected to France, including Henri Christophe and Jean-Jacques Dessalines, realized they had been betrayed. They understood that once the French felt secure, these black generals would be arrested or killed, and slavery would be restored. In October 1802, they switched sides again, rejoining the revolution and bringing their troops with them. Jean-Jacques Dessalines emerged as the new leader of the revolutionary forces. Unlike Toussaint, who had sometimes shown mercy to defeated enemies and tried to preserve the colony's economic infrastructure, Dessalines was utterly ruthless. He had been born into slavery, bore scars from brutal whippings, and had no sympathy for slaveholders or the French. His strategy was simple: kill every French soldier and drive them into the sea. The French found themselves fighting a war they couldn't win. Yellow fever was killing French soldiers faster than combat. The Black Army, now reunited and fighting for survival, was larger and more motivated than ever. Supply lines from France were being disrupted by the British Navy as Britain and France were at war again. French forces controlled only a few coastal towns, and even those were under constant attack. General Leclerc died of yellow fever in November 1802 and was replaced by General Rochambeau, who responded to military setbacks with genocidal policies. Rochambeau imported man-eating dogs from Cuba to hunt down black soldiers. He drowned hundreds of captured black soldiers. He used sulfur to gas prisoners to death in shipholds. These atrocities only strengthened black resistance. The war became explicitly racial. This was about the survival of black freedom against white attempts to reimpose slavery. In November 1803, the remaining French forces were trapped at Cap Français, surrounded by Dessalines' army and blockaded by British ships. Rochambeau, with 8,000 surviving French troops, surrendered to the British rather than to Dessalines, knowing that surrender to the Black Army meant death. The French were allowed to evacuate. Of the 60,000 French troops sent to Saint-Domingue over 2 years, fewer than 10,000 survived to leave. The rest died from yellow fever, combat, or disease. It was one of the worst military disasters in French history. On January 1, 1804, Jean-Jacques Dessalines declared the independence of Haiti, restoring the indigenous Taino name for the island. The declaration was revolutionary not just in its assertion of independence, but in its racial implications. This was a nation founded by former slaves, explicitly rejecting white supremacy and colonial rule. The declaration stated, "We have dared to be free. Let us dare to be so by ourselves and for ourselves." But Dessalines didn't stop at independence. In February and March 1804, he ordered the systematic massacre of the remaining white French population in Haiti. Between 3,000 and 5,000 white French people were killed. Dessalines justified this atrocity as necessary to prevent any possibility of France retaking the island and restoring slavery. White people meant slavery, and slavery had to be permanently destroyed. The Haitian Revolution was the only successful slave revolt in human history. Enslaved people had risen up against one of the most powerful empires in the world and won. They had defeated the armies of France, Spain, and Britain. They had created the first Black Republic and the second independent nation in the Western Hemisphere after the United States. They had abolished slavery permanently and declared that all people, regardless of race, were free and equal citizens. The world's response was silence and sabotage. The United States, despite having just fought its own revolution for independence, refused to recognize Haiti for 60 years. President Thomas Jefferson, himself a slaveholder, feared that recognition would inspire slave rebellions in the American South. The U.S. joined European powers in imposing a trade embargo on Haiti, attempting to strangle the new nation economically. France demanded compensation for the loss of its colony. In 1825, France sent warships to Haiti and demanded 150 million francs, roughly $21 billion in today's money, as payment for the stolen property of French slaveholders, including compensation for the slaves themselves who had freed themselves. Haiti, facing military invasion and economic isolation, agreed to pay. This debt and the interest on loans taken to pay it would cripple Haiti's economy for over a century. Haiti didn't finish paying off this extortion until 1947. The revolution's impact on world history was enormous, but often unacknowledged. The loss of Saint-Domingue was one factor that led Napoleon to sell the Louisiana Territory to the United States in 1803, doubling the size of America. The revolution terrified slaveholders throughout the Americas, leading to harsher slave codes and brutal suppression of any signs of resistance. But it also inspired enslaved people everywhere with the knowledge that freedom could be won through armed resistance. The revolution produced remarkable leaders. Toussaint Louverture, who rose from slavery to become a military genius and statesman. Jean-Jacques Dessalines, who completed the revolution and became Haiti's first emperor. Henri Christophe, who would later become king of northern Haiti and built the massive Citadelle La Ferrière, the largest fortress in the Americas, as protection against French reinvasion. But Haiti's independence came at an enormous cost. 13 years of brutal warfare had destroyed the colony's infrastructure. Tens of thousands had died. The plantation economy was shattered. The indemnity debt to France would hobble economic development for generations. The massacre of white French people, while understandable given the brutality of slavery, eliminated most of the colony's educated elite, engineers, and merchants. Haiti started its independence impoverished, isolated, and facing the hostility of every slaveholding power. The revolution also left complex racial legacies within Haiti itself. The conflict between black Haitians and mixed-race Haitians that had emerged during the revolution continued after independence, creating political divisions that persist today. Dessalines, who became Emperor Jacques I, was assassinated in 1806 by his own officers, splitting the country into northern and southern kingdoms that feuded for years. The question remains, why isn't the Haitian Revolution better known? Why do American students learn extensively about the American and French revolutions, but often learn nothing about Haiti? Part of the answer is racism, the discomfort of acknowledging that enslaved black people defeated European armies. Part is the narrative of history being written by the powerful, and Haiti, economically devastated and politically isolated, had no power to ensure its story was told. But the Haitian Revolution deserves to be remembered as one of history's great liberation movements. The people who fought in it were among the bravest in human history. They fought knowing that defeat meant not just death, but torture and re-enslavement. They fought without reliable weapons, training, or supplies. They fought against professional armies equipped with modern weapons, and they won.